Imagine a time when the Appalachian Mountains still belonged more to bears and ghosts than to men. The year is 1886. The railroads haven't reached these ridges yet. Lantern light barely pushes back the dark, and once you step off the wagon road, the forest swallows sound itself. In a scattered cluster of hamlets along the West Virginia line, something began taking women. Not one or two. 25. All between the ages of 16 and 32. All gone between dusk and dawn. All vanished so completely that even the bloodhounds circled, whined, and lay down with their tails between their legs. No screams carried down the hollows. No torn clothing. No footprints leading away, only, sometimes, a single bare heel print pressed so deep into the mud it looked like the earth itself had tried to keep hold and failed. The old folks locked their doors and spoke of skinwalkers. The preachers thundered about sin, calling judgment out of the wilderness. But the hunters, the ones who knew every deer trail and ginseng patch, they spoke of something worse. They called it the feral mountain man. They said he had once been human. That something in these ancient mountains had unmade him, stripped him down to hunger and speed and silence. That he no longer walked like a man, but flowed between the trees like mist with teeth. That when the moon was new and the night was black as buried coal, you could hear him breathing just outside the circle of your firelight. And then even the crickets would stop. 25 women walked into these woods and never walked out. 25 names carved on rough pine boards above empty graves. And somewhere, high in a laurel hell no axe has ever touched, something still waits that has never stopped being hungry. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen. Even now, more than a century later. Don't you almost hear it? A voice. Soft. Calling from the dark between the trees. Calling your name. It was late October 1886, and the first hard frost had already painted the ridges white. Eliza McKendry, 23 years old, pretty in the quiet way that made people trust her with their children, closed the little Pine Grove schoolhouse the way she had every weekday since spring. She locked the door with the big iron key, slipped it into the pocket of her gray wool coat, and tucked the primer and slate she still carried home for marking into her satchel. The children had already scattered down the switchback trails toward their cabins that smoked faintly in the dusk, their laughter swallowed quickly by the trees. Eliza lived 3 miles away, up a narrow trace that followed Laurel Fork before climbing the benchland to her father's farm. She had walked it alone hundreds of times. The path was so familiar she could have followed it blindfolded, past the stand of sugar maples that bled red this time of year, across the footlog where the creek ran black and quick, then up the rise where the chestnuts used to grow before the blight took them. She always timed it so she reached home just as her mother rang the supper bell. That evening the sky was clear, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs, and a thin new moon hung like a clipped silver coin above the western spine. She never made the footlog. Her father, uneasy when the bell went unrung, lit a lantern and started down the trace with Eliza's younger brother. They called her name until their voices cracked. At the schoolhouse they found the door locked, the fire in the little stove long dead, her lunch pail still on the shelf exactly where she always left it. On the porch rail lay her scarlet knit scarf, neatly folded as though she had paused to tidy it before stepping off into the stoop. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was out of place except Eliza herself. By midnight half the valley was on the mountain with pine knot torches and barking dogs. They swept the trail again and again, beating the laurel slicks with sticks, shining lanterns into every hollow log and cave mouth. They found no footprint but her own, small, neat, pointed toward home, stopping suddenly in the middle of the path as if the earth had simply opened and closed again without a sound. 20 paces farther on, the dogs refused to go, hackles raised, whining into the dark like they had scented death itself wearing a man's shape. That was the first. Long before anyone spoke the name Feral Mountain Man aloud, Eliza McKendry became the silence that taught the mountains how to swallow a woman whole. 3 days after Eliza vanished, the search widened into a grim pilgrimage. Men from 3 counties rode in with rifles slung and dogs straining at rope leashes, their breath pluming white in the cold. They started at the schoolhouse at dawn, sweeping outward in ragged lines, boots crunching through frost-stiffened leaves. The mountain air carried the smell of wood smoke and impending snow, and every man kept his eyes down, afraid to look too long at the dark wall of rhododendron that pressed in from both sides. They found the ribbon just after noon. It was caught 30 feet off the trail, high in a lightning-scarred beech whose trunk rose straight and smooth as a ship's mast. The tree stood alone in a small clearing no wider than a cabin floor, ringed by laurel so thick a man would need a machete to force passage. Eliza's ribbon, bright crimson wool her mother had knit the previous Christmas, fluttered from a strip of bark peeled back like a curled lip. The fabric was snagged cleanly, as though someone had hooked it there on purpose, yet the lowest branch was 15 feet above the ground and the trunk offered no foothold at all. A young farmer named Caleb would climbed it first, shinnying up with a rope thrown over a higher limb. When he reached the ribbon he went still, staring at the bark beneath it. The others below saw his face drain of color before he even spoke. Deep claw-like gouges radiated outward from the snagged place, 5 parallel furrows raked downward through the hard beechwood as if something with talons the length of a man's fingers had tried to climb and slipped. The cuts were fresh, the pale inner wood still bleeding thin sap that smelled sharp and sweet. Below, the dogs went mad. They lunged toward the tree, then veered away with tails tucked, refusing to put their noses to the ground. One hound, a big blue tick famed for trailing bear, simply lay down and trembled, urine darkening the leaves beneath him. No print led to the beach. No print led away. Only Eliza's small, unmistakable boot marks coming down the trail from the schoolhouse, clear as ink until the frost had preserved them, and then nothing, as though she had stepped off the path and been lifted straight into the sky. The men stood in a silent ring, staring up at that impossible ribbon whipping in the wind like a tiny flag of surrender, and for the first time felt the mountain watching them back. Winter came early that year, clamping down hard after Thanksgiving with ice that glazed the creeks and wind that found every crack in a cabin wall. The men told themselves the cold would stop, it would drive whatever stalked the ridges into hibernation, or at least slow it down. Instead the disappearances quickened, as though the thing in the woods fed on the dark itself. After Eliza came Mary Kate Lively, 19, taken from her own clothesline while hanging sheets in the last pale light of afternoon. Then the twin sisters, Ruth and Ruby Caldwell, both 21, vanished the same night while walking home from a corn shucking at the Farley place. 1 week later Sarah and Pugh stepped out to the springhouse for butter and never returned. Her lantern was found burning on the path, wick trimmed, glass spotless. By February the tally stood at 12. By the first muddy thaw in March it was 19. The last to go before the final count froze at 25 was a bride named Violet Mercer, abducted from her wedding quilt while her new husband slept off the whiskey 3 steps away in the same bed. Every case carried the same eerie signature. No struggle. No blood. No cry that traveled farther than the cabin walls. Women simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next, leaving behind a shawl on a peg, a shoe on the doorsill, a half-finished row of knitting with the needles still warm from living fingers. The trails always ended the same way, one set of dainty footprints walking toward home, then nothing, as though the mountain had inhaled. Panic spread faster than the news could ride. Families nailed their doors at dusk and kept them barred until the roosters screamed. Fathers stood guard with loaded rifles across their knees, falling asleep only to wake and find another name added to the list. Preachers ran out of scripture, sheriffs ran out of promises. Posses rode out bristling with guns and came back hollow-eyed, trailing dogs that would no longer hunt. 25 women in 8 months, all within a rough circle 40 miles across, all gone so cleanly that not one shred of cloth or lock of hair ever surfaced to prove they had fought. In the taverns men stopped boasting and started whispering. In the churches women stopped singing and started praying with their eyes open. And on the high balds where the wind never ceased, something moved between the stunted spruce, patient and tireless, adding another empty place at another supper table while the snow kept falling and falling, as if the mountains themselves were trying to bury the evidence before spring could betray what they had taken. The first man to see him and live was Josiah McCoy, a bear hunter from the head of Dry Fork who had tracked wounded Bruins from Georgia to Pennsylvania and never once turned back. It happened on a raw March morning when the snow still lay knee-deep in the Laurel Hells and the sky looked bruised from horizon to horizon. Josiah had been following an old boar whose track showed a limp when he cut a second set of prints crossing the bear's path, human but wrong. They were bare, long and narrow, the toes splayed like a wolf's, the stride impossibly wide, 8-9 feet between steps. The prints ran straight up a slope so steep a man would need hands and knees, and they never slipped once in the crusted snow. Josiah followed them anyway, curiosity stronger than sense, until the trail spilled into a thicket of rhododendron so dense the light inside was green and sickly. There the tracks simply stopped. No turn, no crouch, no sign the maker had leapt or climbed. Just gone. That was when he heard the breathing. It came from above, soft, steady, patient. Josiah looked up slowly. 20 feet overhead, balanced on a limb no thicker than his wrist, crouched a man. Naked despite the cold. Skin the color of river clay, streaked with old scars and fresh blood. Hair and beard grown together into a black mane that hung to his waist, moving like something alive. The eyes were the worst, yellow, bright, fixed on Josiah with the flat hunger of a cat watching a bird through glass. Josiah's rifle was already at his shoulder, but his hands would not finish the motion. The thing tilted its head, nostrils flaring, and Josiah felt the air leave his lungs as if the mountain had sucked it away. Then it moved, not down, not across, but away, flowing along the limb and into the tangle of branches faster than a squirrel, soundless, leaving only a single drop of blood that fell spinning and struck the snow beside Josiah's boot with a hiss like hot iron. By the time Josiah stumbled back to the settlement, his beard was white with frost and his voice shook so badly he could not strike a lucifer. He told the story once, in a tavern thick with pipe smoke and disbelief, then never spoke of it again. But every hunter who went out after that carried a second load in his pouch, buckshot for bears and silver dimes for whatever Josiah McCoy had seen running upright through the laurel on two legs that were almost, but not quite, human. April brought the first real thaw, and with it Abel Carver went missing for 3 days. Abel was a solitary trapper who worked the highest coves, a man so quiet folks said he could walk through a turkey flock without waking a single bird. When his mangy cur, Blue, came limping home alone with its belly slit ear to ear, the men knew Abel would not be far behind, or what was left of him. They found the dog first, laid out in a small natural clearing above the spruce line where the wind moaned through the rocks like a dying woman. Blue had been gutted with one clean stroke, entrails drawn out and arranged in a perfect circle of glistening coils around the body. Every organ was placed with care, heart in the center, liver north, lungs east and west, the long ropes of intestine laid in an unbroken spiral that ended at the dog's own muzzle, as though it had been forced to swallow its death. The stones that ringed the circle, 25 of them, each the size of a man's fist, had been carried from the creek half a mile below. Water still dripped from their undersides and froze in tiny icicles that pointed inward like accusing fingers. The fire beside it was the coldest thing any of them had ever seen. A neat stack of wrist-thick maple limbs laid teepee fashion, bark shaved smooth, shavings curled beneath like kindling, yet no coal glowed, no ash drifted. The wood was cold as creek stone, as if the fire had been dressed hours earlier and simply refused to burn. A single set of bare footprints led to the edge of the circle and stopped. Nothing led away. They buried Blue where he lay, too unnerved to move him, and marked the place with a cairn of those same 25 stones. That night every dog for 10 miles around began to bark at once, a frantic, desperate sound that rose and rose until men stumbled outside with lanterns, certain the world was ending. Then, just as suddenly, silence fell, thick and absolute. Not one dog ever barked again in that valley. Some starved rather than eat, others vanished into the woods and were never seen. The few that lived out the year did so without a sound, eyes wide and haunted, as though they waited for the hand that had arranged Blue's insides to come back and finish whatever message it had started writing in blood and stone and perfect, impossible circles. Why may the children had stopped playing past the first shadow of evening. Doors that once stood open until the stars came out were barred before the sun touched the western ridge, and every cabin window glowed with 2 lanterns instead of one, as though extra light could keep the dark from pressing its face against the glass. The little ones invented the name first. They called him the Men Who Eats Moonlight. It started as a whisper among the schoolchildren at Pine Grove, the same building Eliza McKendry had locked for the last time. A boy swore he saw a shadow taller than the chimney slide across the moon when he got up to use the privy. A girl claimed that if you left a bowl of milk on the porch after dark, it would be gone by morning, but the bowl would be turned upside down and licked so clean it shone like new pewter. Another child said the man didn't walk, he poured himself from tree to tree the way water spills downhill, and if water could laugh without making a sound. Soon every child in the valley carried the same picture in their heads, a long black shape with arms too long and fingers that ended in black hooks, crouching on rooftops when the moon was thin, drinking its silver the way a drunk drinks corn liquor. They said if you heard your name spoken in a voice that sounded like wine through dead leaves, you must never answer, because the second time he said it he would be inside the house, and the third time you would be gone. Mothers found their sons and daughters sitting bolt upright in bed long after midnight, eyes wide, blankets clutched to chins, listening. Some wet the bed for the first time since infancy. Others refused to sleep at all, begging to keep the fire roaring until dawn. A 6-year-old in the cove below Dry Fork carved the name into her kitchen table with a butcher knife while her parents slept. He eats moonlight. When asked why, she only pressed her hands over her ears and rocked, whispering that the trees outside were teaching him new words every night, and soon he would know all their names. Even the boldest boys, the ones who once roamed the ridges with slingshots and bragging rights, now ran home before the last light failed, boots hammering the porch planks like their lives depended on it. And in the hush that followed, when the whippoorwills began and then suddenly stopped, every child in every cabin pulled the covers over their head and waited for the soft scrape of long nails across the shingles, tasting moonlight, learning how to open a door from the wrong side. June heat settled over the mountains like a fever, thick and airless, the kind that made dogs lie panting in the dust and men speak in short, angry bursts. The disappearances had paused since Violet Mercer in March, and some dared to hope the thing had moved on or died or been driven back into whatever crack between worlds it had crawled out of. Then, on the longest day of the year, old Granny Sequoia walked down from her cabin on the ridge above Sinking Creek with a bundle of sassafras root and a warning no one wanted to hear. She was past 80, skin dark and smooth as walnut, hair still black and braided with hawk feathers. Her people had lived in these mountains before the treaties, before the long walk west, and she spoke English only when she chose to. That afternoon she chose to, standing in the middle of the dusty road while the sheriff and half the town watched from the porch of the courthouse. She said the mountain was hungry again. Not the land itself, but something older that lived inside the bones of the land. It woke every 87 years, she told them, when the dogwood bloomed blood red and the new moon fell on the summer solstice. It had taken women in 1799, when her own grandmother was a girl, 25 then too, gone between dusk and dawn, their names still whispered in the old language when the fire burned low. The whites had called it fever or Indians or runaway slaves. Her people knew better. They marked the cycle on a cedar post hidden in a cave above the falls, notches deep as grief. She told the sheriff the thing was not a man anymore, maybe never had been. It wore a man's shape the way a hunter wears a deerskin, to walk among the herd without startling it. It fed on what made a woman, the part that carried tomorrow inside it, and when it was done it left the shell somewhere the crows could finish the lesson. The only mercy was that it slept between feasts, 87 years of silence, but the sleep was ending. The mountain had opened its mouth again, and 25 was only the beginning tithe. The men laughed uneasily and offered her coffee. She refused. Instead she laid the sassafras root on the courthouse steps, split it with one stroke of the sheriff's own axe so the red heartwood bled, and walked away without looking back. That night every dogwood on the ridge bloomed the color of fresh slaughter, and the new moon rose thin and sharp as a skinning knife above the silent, waiting trees. July 17, 1886. Clara Witt, 26, the blacksmith's wife from Red Ash, had gone to gather blackberries along the bench above the river. She left at dawn with a tin pail and a kiss for her sleeping husband, promising pie by supper. When the sun stood straight overhead and she had not returned, the men assumed she had simply wandered farther than usual. By dusk they were frantic. 11 days later she came back. The searchers found her just after moonrise, stumbling down the wagon trace toward the river ford as though the road itself were pulling her home. She was barefoot, her dress hanging in ribbons the color of old blood, the pail long gone. Her hair, once chestnut and thick to her waist, had gone snow-white, every strand, even the lashes that ringed eyes too wide and too dark. She weighed little more than a child, the bones of her wrists showed sharp as tent pegs. She did not speak. Not that night, not ever again. When her husband tried to lift her she shrank into the corner of the porch like a kicked dog, arms wrapped around her head. The only sound she made was a low, continuous keening that rose and fell with her breathing, the way wind moves through a cracked chimney. They carried her inside and laid her on her own bed. That was when they saw the carving. Both arms, from wrist to elbow, were covered in the same symbol repeated over and over, cut shallow but precise, the lines still red and weeping. A spiral that began as a circle, then curled inward 3 times before ending in a sharp hook, like a tongue tasting the air. The cuts were fresh enough that some had only just clotted, yet the pattern was perfect, impossibly, identical on both arms, mirror perfect, as though the blade had been guided by something that saw from the inside of her skin. They tried to wash the wounds. She fought them silently, teeth bared, until they bound her wrists with strips of sheet. Within an hour the linen was soaked scarlet, the symbols had reopened themselves, the cuts widening as if tiny unseen mouths were worrying them larger. By morning the sheets were stiff with blood and the spiral stood out livid and perfect, deeper now, almost to the bone. She lived 3 more days without sleeping, eyes fixed on the ceiling, carving the air with fingers that never stopped moving, tracing that same curling mark again and again, as though trying to write her way back through whatever door had closed behind her in the blackberry thicket. On the 3rd night the keening stopped. When they went in at dawn she was sitting upright, staring toward the open window where the first pale light touched the mountains. Her lips were still shaped around a word no one heard, and the spiral on each arm had finally reached the center the morning after Clara Witt was laid in the ground. Caleb Witt, her brother-in-law and the same man who had climbed the lightning-scarred beach for Eliza's ribbon, rode out alone with a lantern, a skinning knife, and a ball of twine. He carried a terror so sharp it felt like fever, but he carried something else too, a need to understand what had been done to the women of his blood. He started at the place Clara had been found, then worked backward, quartering the ground like a hound. By noon he discovered the first mark, the same hooked spiral Clara had carved into her own arms, only this one was hacked deep into the bark of an ancient hemlock, the cuts blackened with old sap. The tree stood a mile from any trail, in a laurel slick so thick the sun came down only in needles of green light. He tied the end of his twine to the trunk and paid it out behind him as he walked on. Every half-mile or so he found another. Always on the oldest trees, hemlock, chestnut oak, yellow poplar, always the same spiral, always facing east. The cuts were high, 10 or 12 feet off the ground, as though the carver had stood on something that left no print. By late afternoon he had counted 9 marks, the twine stretching behind him like a pale worm through the undergrowth. He almost missed the 10th. It was smaller, hidden beneath a curtain of muscadine vine, but when he pulled the leaves away the spiral glowed fresh and wet, the sap still running. The tree stood at the lip of a narrow hollow he had never seen before, though he had hunted these ridges since boyhood. The ground fell away steeply into shadow, and the air that rose from it smelled of wet stone and something sweeter, like lilies left too long in a sickroom. Caleb knelt and studied the marks. When he laid them out in his mind, connecting tree to tree, the twine formed a perfect slow coil that tightened with every turn, a spiral identical to the one on Clara's arms, only miles across. The final mark sat at the outer edge, the hollow below him was the center. He looked down and saw, far below in the gloom, a faint answering gleam, 25 pale shapes arranged in a circle around something darker. He knew without counting what the shapes were. The wind shifted, bringing up the smell of rot and lilies and cold iron, and the twine in his hand went suddenly slack, as though the mountain had just taken a breath and decided whether or not to swallow him too. October 23, 1886. The blood moon rose fat and low, the color of a fresh butcher's apron, and every rooster in the valley held its tongue. At 9 o'clock sharp the dogs began. It started in the farthest coves first, a single frantic bark that turned into a howl, then another voice joining, then 10, then hundreds, rising together from every farmstead and mining camp between the Gauley and the New River. The sound was not anger or warning, it was pure terror, the kind that tears a throat raw. Men stumbled out with rifles, women clutched babies to their breasts, lanterns swung wild arcs across dooryards. The howling rolled down the hollows like a wave after wave of black water, louder, closer, until the mountains themselves seemed to scream through the dogs' mouths. Then, at the stroke of 10, it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As if every dog had been struck dead at once. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against eardrums, thick as river fog. Lantern flames burned straight and blue, afraid to flicker. Even the crickets had gone. In that hush people heard the second sound, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the ground itself, slow as a dying heart, felt in the soles of bare feet on puncheon floors, in the ribs of horses tied to rails, in the bellies of sleeping children. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, traveling the spine of the mountain from the hidden hollow Caleb Wood had found to every cabin within 20 miles. With each pulse the blood moon seemed to brighten, until the ridges stood out sharp as knives and every tree cast a shadow black enough to drown in. Up on the high balds, snow that had no business falling in October began to drift down, fat flakes the color of rust. They melted the instant they touched skin, leaving red smears like fingerprints. Mothers found their children standing at windows, palms pressed to the cold panes, eyes reflecting the moon though no light reached inside the room. One old man in a tar paper shack swore he saw every axe and scythe in his shed rise an inch off their pegs and hang trembling, blades pointed toward the hollow, quivering like compass needles. The thumping grew faster, closer to the surface, until floorboards drummed beneath rocking chairs and coffee cups danced off tables and shattered unheard. Then, at the 3rd hour past midnight, the mountain took one last breath. The moon bled out to black. Every lantern snuffed itself at once. And in the dark that came after, something high in the laurel hill opened its eyes and looked straight into the valley with a hunger older than the rocks it lived beneath, satisfied for now, already counting the days until the next turning of the wheel.